It is very unique that we have named the Center for Studies of Plural Societies, so that we can invest and we can focus on these efforts. And we can study many other things from this philosophical point of view. And we are fortunate enough that we came into contact of Professor Sindre Banstad, who has been studying these aspects, especially in case of Europe. And he has closely followed the media uses of in European societies, especially the Muslim population, and of course the rise of Islamophobia, which is a reality in case of Europe. So we it is going to be a great opportunity for us, for CSPS, and for the scholars of CSPS, and for the listeners who have today joined to understand this subject, this important subject, from the very resource person who is observing these changes and who is academically engaged in these kind of discussions. So I would welcome Professor Sindre for this important talk, and I would also thank our professor for sharing this session. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the session formally to Professor Bhaswati Sarkar, so that she can start the session. So thank you very much. Over to you, Professor Bhaswati.
Thank you, Dr. Anas. Very good morning and good evening, both to all our participants who have joined, and good morning for our speaker for this evening. I would like to, at the onset, thank the Center for Studies of Plural Societies for inviting me to chair this session. It's something which is of very, great interest to me, looking at Europe and its diversity, which you just highlighted, and how these societies have become diverse over a period of time, and as a kind of a diversity which you rightly pointed out is irreversible. So the big question is, how do we stay together, or how does Europe stay together with this diversity? So I think what Professor Banstad has chosen for his distinguished lecture today is a very interesting topic, because the initial, the topic which was shared with me was Muslims in European citizenry, with a caption, "How does it feel to be a problem?" And that ended with a question mark. And I thought it is absolutely necessary to talk about this and to understand what is happening in Europe. Because what we have been seeing in Europe for some time now is, coming to terms with this diversity that we just talked of. So how do you accommodate your, new citizens, and particularly the Muslim citizens? And this we have seen, this is as a kind of a struggle on both sides, a kind of a tussle. And this tussle and struggle actually becomes more evident, I feel, as the first generation gives way to the second and the third generation. And it's a tussle which I think is not just between, the two, between the host society and the newcomers, but it is also as much a struggle within these groups. So if you're looking at the Muslim citizenry, it's not just the Muslim citizenry vis-a-vis the other, larger context, but it's also within the Muslim population itself, or the Muslim groups itself, themselves, how they deal with their intergenerational issues and conflicts, and the questions which arise from living in a different kind of a society. So what we have seen in Europe essentially has been, kind of a change in the discourse, the strategy, the policies, where we have seen a shift from multiculturalism to interculturalism, to with an emphasis which is now very much given on integration, which is basically highlighting the host culture, tradition, customs, language. So all of these elements are elements of integration. And we have seen the different, leaders, how they have actually embodied this shift, where we see like leaders like Cameron, who talked about failure of multiculturalism and talked about the need for muscular liberalism. Or we have seen Merkel talking about the failure of multiculturalism. We have seen a complete U-turn so far as Netherlands is considered in terms of its earlier multicultural policies to more stringent requirements in terms of who becomes a citizen and who is accepted, and how it's important to be integrated and accept the host society's culture, tradition, language. So these are the developments which we see in Europe. But at the same time, you also see in Europe from within the Muslim community some voices about an articulation about how perhaps to live in a different terrain. And that kind of response has been to an extent a response which articulates the idea of Euro-Islam. Now, whether that works, whether that is the possible way forward, these are the things I think which we need to basically debate, that whether this can be a possible way in which one can think of how communities come together. And I'm sure that all of these complexities of living together, of diversity that has been thrown up, will come up in today's lecture. So I'm sure the difficulties and the possibilities of, wherein, how much can you do, and where do we need to negotiate and bargain and compromise, because the compromise has to come from both sides. I'm sure these are the things which we will know about more in terms of their complexities in today's lecture. I welcome Professor Banstad for delivering the lecture. I think you have about 40 minutes for the lecture, followed by a 20 minutes discussion. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Let me first start out by saying that it is a great honor and privilege to have been invited to give this distinguished lecture for the Center for the Study of Plural Societies. So I would first like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Umar Anas for the generous invitation. Also to Professor Bhaswati Sarkar for agreeing to chair this event. But I've been invited to address the question, Muslims in European citizenry, how does it feel to be a problem? And I will be speaking for approximately 40 minutes. I hope not to tire you completely out, and I very much welcome and look forward to your engagement with what I will have to say. So this question, how does it feel to be a problem, as many of you will be aware of, comes from The Souls of Black Folk, the famous work by the great US sociologist and civil rights activist B.E.B. Du Bois. And according to distinguished historians of racism, such as Francisco Bethencourt and George M. Fredrickson, the first demonstrable iteration of racism in Europe occurred in the context of the Catholic Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, in other words, present-day Spain and Portugal, in the 13th and 14th century, known as La Reconquista. And this involved the targeting of Muslims and Jewish Moriscos and conversos. Moriscos was the Spanish term for Muslim converts to Catholicism, and conversos, the term for Jewish converts to Catholicism. These were converts who, under the threat of torture or expulsion, had converted to Catholicism in the course of the Catholic reconquest of what was then the Almoravid Empire of Al-Andalus, and their descendants for centuries to come. These Moriscos and conversos and their descendants through the Patri line were for centuries barred from public and religious office, were forced to wear public markers of their status as second-class citizens, and had to live in segregated residential quarters. Now, what is noteworthy for our purposes here in this specific case is that there was no concept of biological race in existence in the Spanish language at the time. La raza, or race, was a feudal concept which referred to hereditary nobility, or caste, if you like, which is not to say that the racism and discrimination against Muslim Moriscos and Jewish conversos was purely cultural and non-biological at this particular historical conjuncture. for the key concept motivating and legitimating this racist and discriminatory treatment of Muslims and Jewish descendants was, after all, what was known in Spanish as limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, in which only Christian blood, what on earth that may actually be for those of us who abide by science rather than racial mythologies, was sufficiently pure to be trustworthy. It is not as if the Moriscos and conversos accepted this state of affairs without resistance. If we look closely at the histories of Muslim and Jewish migrations in and around the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, Turkey, Palestine, Israel, and Egypt, and you will soon enough discover that hundreds of thousands resisted this racist regime and Catholic regime by fleeing from the remains of Al-Andalus. In his 2015 Between the World and Me, the great African-American author and public intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates writes that race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. Difference in hue and hair is old, but the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society, and that they signify deeper attributes which are indelible, this is the new idea at the heart of these new people who have been brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. The case of the racism and discrimination against the Moriscos and the conversos, which followed in the wake of the Catholic Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, demonstrate that racism is historically antecedent to the concept of race. In other words, racism comes before the biological concept of race, and indeed need not presuppose a biological concept of race at all. For in the Spanish language, it was not until centuries later, and in the context of the drive towards scientific, or pseudo-scientific, if truth be told, classification of humans that emerged in the context of the European Enlightenment and the European colonial exploration and exploitation that followed from the 16th century onwards, that the concept of race became tethered to ideas about human biology. We forget this at our peril. Race and racism are ideas about human difference and the implications of those differences that always have been and always will be made and unmade by humans. So that is the choice we're faced with. Race is socially constructed, but unfortunately have very real social and material consequences for those racialized, by which we as scholars mean to refer to the process of assigning race-like characteristics that are seen as unchanging, essentialized, and unchangeable to certain groups of people. Think of the category of Muslim in European public discourses over the past decades, and you will soon enough discover that that's a very essentialized concept. The idea here being that there are certain characteristics pertaining to being and identifying as a Muslim that are unchangeable, that are essential. We can actually trace this very process through which the erstwhile Iberian Muslims of Al-Andalus came to be racialized through some of the most iconic Spanish representations of the Catholic Reconquista centuries later. So this is a classical Spanish painting of representing the Catholic Reconquista of Al-Andalus. This was actually painted centuries afterwards, right? So this is the painter's way of imagining what one of the key battles of La Reconquista might have looked like. One notes here that the Muslim Moors in the painting are thoroughly racialized, right? They're represented as African, Black African, and in a slave-like state, right? What we know of the Almohavid empire that ruled Al-Andalus is, of course, that these were Berber, North African Berbers. So more likely than not to be quite fair-skinned and to look very much like, you know, the Iberian Catholics that they fought against, right? Now, the great cultural studies scholars, that was the late Stuart Hall, whom some of you might have heard of, referred to race as a floating or sliding signifier, by which we meant to imply that race has through the centuries represented a fundamental mode of thinking about human difference, but one which unfortunately seemed ever-changing and adaptable to new circumstances. So it seems to us, if we look at modern human history, that we can't do away with this concept and what it does to our thinking of human about human difference. And this is in spite of what scientists are telling us. I mean, there is no such thing as biological race. The past is never past, declared the great novelist William Faulkner, and the Catholic Reconquista has, of course, been widely reactivated as a frame of reference and a mode of understanding the present among all kinds of European and American white supremacists and racists in our dark times. The idea here being that Muslim immigrants and their descendants are but historical intruders or even invaders on a European and American continent, which properly belongs to us. In other words, to those racialized as white. As scientists, we do of course know perfectly well that human history is above all and essentially the history of human migrations, of mixing and of coexistence, but that history and the long and rich histories of Muslim presence in various parts of the European continent, think here of Bosnia, think of the Iberian Peninsula, think of Spain, Portugal, can always be suppressed by the racial fantasizers of the present, with all their existential fears of what the anthropologist Ayun Appadurai has referred to as small numbers, and the illusions about the purity of coded whiteness. To my mind, it hardly seems a coincidence that people of Muslim background have more than any other group in present Europe faced a process of a thoroughgoing racialization, as my distinguished colleagues Professor Nassar Mir and Tariq Madood were among the first to point out over a decade ago now. For in Europe, we are in fundamental ways back to where we started in the Iberian Peninsula all those centuries ago. What the Hungarian scholar G.M. Thomas, in a remarkably prescient essay for the Boston Review published as early in 2000, referred to as post-fascism, is all over us in Europe these days. From Hungary and Russia via Sweden to Italy, parties and political formations which adhere to fascist ideas and or have fascist genealogies are back in power. Recall here that fascism is at its very heart an ultra-nationalist and profoundly patriarchal ideology which declares the nation to be a sacred entity under all sorts of existential threats from internal and external enemies, and one which, if necessary, must be salvaged and protected through the most apocalyptic means. In other words, war, if necessary. When we say with Thomas that Europe is post-fascist, we also mean to refer to the fact that it is not an iteration of fascism which appears in the same guise as historical fascism in Europe in the period 1920 to 1945, but one which in many respects certainly mimics it. The danger that this poses for all of us, but our fellow citizens, brothers and sisters of Muslim background in particular, given that Islamophobia is, as my friend and colleague, Professor Farid Hafez, never tires of pointing out, the great unifying theme for the contemporary European right, it is not only that it both declares racism to be but a natural and perfectly legitimate human resentiment, but that it also is fundamentally corrosive of any idea of human universality and any presumption of equal human rights to life and dignity, which, as you will of course be perfectly well aware of, is so central not only to the UN Human Rights Declaration, the European Convention on Human Rights, but also to the Indian Constitution. A pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will, this is where we are, and fight it we must, in ways small and large, and to the best of our capabilities, whatever we do, and through the peaceful and democratic means at the disposal for those of us committed to what my great and illustrious friend Professor Paul Gilroy has, in harking back to the great sage that was Aimé Césaire, referred to as a planetary humanism made to the measure of the world. Now, that was a rather long-winded introduction to the country of my birth, Norway, which offers a small prism for thinking through Islamophobia in its wider and transnational context in the present. And I say this perfectly aware of the fact that we're talking about a relatively small and peripheral country in Northern Europe with a population of 5 million inhabitants. So that is, in speaking about that, I'm also aware that and these were actually 2 terrorist attacks, and they were set off by a then 34-year-old white Norwegian male right-wing extremist from Oslo West, who was also a white supremacist, and he first set up a self-made fertilizer bomb at government headquarters in the Norwegian capital of Oslo, which killed 8 people and maimed a dozen others, and virtually destroyed government headquarters in Norway. It's still not completely rebuilt. Dressed in a fake police uniform, he then proceeded by car to the small and idyllic island of Utøya, some 60 kilometers from Oslo, where he, in the course of a shooting spree which lasted for over an hour, murdered 69 people, mostly completely defenseless Norwegian teenagers attending a summer youth camp organized by the Social Democratic and government-aligned Labour Party youth organization, with shots to their heads. The median age of his victims at Utøya was 18, and his youngest victim was only 13. Not for the first nor for the last time, Norwegians learned that racism kills. Some people will no doubt assert that only a few of his victims happened to be Muslim, but that is frankly beside the point. Having immersed himself in the dark netherworld of online hatred of Muslims for several years leading up to the attack, the perpetrator had convinced himself that Norway and Europe was being overrun by Muslims, and that it was only a matter of time before the European continent would be turned into some kind of Islamic State or caliphate. For the perpetrator, who in his promotional cut and paste track distributed to thousands of people prior to his attacks, was keen to underline that, and this is classical, he was not racist, and even had friends of immigrant background. These were imaginary, as it would soon turn out, before turning to a full-throttle endorsement of a long line of Norwegian, Nordic, and international Nazi murderers and Serbian genocidaires from the genocide in Bosnia in the course of his very first police interrogations, after he was eventually arrested in a clearing in the woods on the island of Utøya as darkness fell over the corpses of his many murder victims. To the perpetrator of these attacks, Muslims were a deeply threatening and homogeneous mass hell-bent on taking over Europe. And his terrorist attacks were meant, in his mind, to signal the onset of a continent-wide civil war, which would eventually result in the ethnic cleansing of Muslims from Norway as well as wider Europe. But those were not Islamophobic terror attacks, others will counter. But when the perpetrator of the terrorist attacks on July 22nd, 2011, chose Norwegian Social Democrats as his targets, it was not because the attacks had to do with them rather than with Muslims. In his target selection, fully documented in his ill-written cut-and-paste track, he makes it abundantly clear that he had first toyed with the idea of a direct attack on Norwegian Muslims during the annual Eid celebrations in Oslo. But he feared that this would, as a terrorist strategy, ultimately be counterproductive in that it might actually turn out to generate public sympathy for Norwegian Muslims in the Norwegian population at large. In any case, in the perpetrator's imaginaries, it was Norwegian Social Democrats, including the womanizing senior Norwegian Social Democratic diplomat, who had practically his father, who had practically abandoned him and his mother when he was but a small child. And yes, there would be ample material for Freudians here, who were ultimately, and these Norwegian Social Democrat efforts were, to his mind, ultimately responsible for having let the first Muslim immigrants to Norway into the country. Some of you familiar with the Norwegian immigration history would know that the first immigrants to Norway, who arrived in the late 1960s, early 1970s, were by and large male migrant laborers from countries like Pakistan, Turkey, Morocco, and even India. The perpetrator's Islamophobia was by no means exclusively Norwegian. The most central ideological influence on his thought, if we are to call such ramblingly inconsistent and fantastical ideas thought, was the Swiss-Israeli Eurabia author known under the pen name Batio, or Daughter of the Nile. Her real name is Giselle Littmann, and she was born to wealthy Italian Jewish parents in Zamalek, Cairo in 1933. And she was among the many Egyptian Jews who left or were expelled from Egypt after the 1952 officers' coup that eventually brought General Gamal Abdel Nasser to power in Egypt in 1954. Littmann, an autodidact scholar who never completed her academic studies, had long-standing links to the Israeli far right. Much like her friends and allies on the Israeli far right, she adored and made friends with the Christian Maronite militia known as the Kataib in Lebanon, who under the leadership of the slain Bashar Gemayel allied itself with the Israeli military forces during the Israeli invasion and occupation of Lebanon during the Lebanese civil war in the 1980s, and who were responsible for the massacre of thousands of Palestinian women and children in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut in 1982. Which people of my generation are certainly old enough to remember, also because this was covered extensively in Norwegian and international news media at the time. And now this Batior of Giselle Littmann also adored and was personally close to the Serbian ultra-nationalist genocidaires, who under the leadership of the war criminals Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic were responsible for some of the worst Serbian war crimes during the war in Bosnia in the 1990s. Her Eurabia theory, in which she posited that the EU, and here it gets quite fantastical, and leading European politicians had ever since the 1970s secretly conspired with the political leaders of Muslim countries in North Africa in order to turn Europe into an Islamic dominion, is nothing but a profoundly racist far-right conspiracy theory. But the basic idea behind this theory is not new and not original at all. It is the long-standing European idea, so absolutely central to European racism and white supremacism for centuries, that Europe is existentially threatened by having religious and or racial minorities in its midst. The perpetrator of the July 22, 2011 terrorist attacks in Norway had come to these ideas through reading the online racist fantasies of one of Batior's most loyal Norwegian followers, the Norwegian racist and far-right blogger Fjordman, whose real name is the rather pedestrian Norwegian name of Peder Are Nøstvold Jensen. As anyone familiar with the perpetrator's cut and paste tract is bound to know, the perpetrator was also quite taken in with Hindu supremacism and the Hindutva movement in India. There are more than 200 references to India in the tract, and the perpetrator certainly saw the Hindutva movement as a potential global ally against Muslims. A Muslim is a Muslim is a Muslim. In the racial imaginaries of Islamophobes in Europe and in Norway, individual ethnic or sectarian distinctions and or differences among Muslims, with which any anthropologist who has ever worked in Muslim communities are well of, matters for naught. And demographic facts are the subject of fantasies for a lot of these people. People of Muslim background represent an estimated 4.2% of the Norwegian population. That was 3.6% in 2011. This estimate actually includes a significant number who are not practicing Muslims at all. If we look at the Muslim population of Norway, for example, it's clear from the available data we happen to have that Muslims of Iranian background, as well as Muslims of Bosnian background, tend to be much less religious than other groups of Muslim origin in Norway, such as Pakistanis and Somalis. And as females of Muslim background and of a second and third generation born and raised in Norway increasingly obtain higher education and marry males with higher education, the number of children that they end up having is fast approximating medium levels for Norwegian females. In other words, the idea that Muslims will take over Norway in Europe because they have so many children is also a part of the fantasy here. But it is also a fact that Norwegian demographers who pointed out these facts back in 2011 ended up receiving death threats for so doing. I happen to have a friend, an old and very senior demographer in Norway, who had to withdraw from public writing and public engagement because he was targeted on the basis of pointing out that the idea that Norway would, on the basis of 3.6% of the population of Muslim background, end up having a Muslim majority was an absolute fantasy. Now, the Arabia conspiracy theory has since been overtaken in Europe as well as in the US by the so-called Great Replacements conspiracy theory, which has to date inspired white supremacist and right-wing extremist terrorist attacks from Christchurch in New Zealand, El Paso in Texas, and Barham in Norway in 2019, and on to Buffalo in New York in 2022. But the latest incarnation of the fear of small numbers really is but the same racist and conspiratorial nonsense in a new wrapping. But the very idea that Muslims are in Norway in order to, by mysterious means, take over Norway and Europe are 11 years on, still very widespread in Norway, with national representative surveys from the Holocaust Center in Oslo in Norway from 2017 indicated that over 30% of respondents in the Norwegian population actually happen to hold such views. And this is deeply frightening, and it also tells us that we are by no means talking about simply a far-right fringe phenomenon here. This is real, and it's dangerous. In the same surveys, Muslims also feature as the co-citizens towards whom respondents express the most negative attitudes, and the co-citizens with whom they are least likely to want to engage on a personal level as neighbors, friends, or family members. Worst off are Muslims who are both Black and Muslims, in other words, of Somali, Gambian, or Senegalese background. The Norwegian anti-racist movement has historically been both secular and leftist. Some of the pioneers in Norway in this movement in the 1970s and 80s were actually well-educated socialists of Pakistani elite background, who for all sorts of reasons having to do with the brutalities of the Islamization by means of military dictatorship in Pakistan under Zia-ul-Haq in the late 1970s and 1980s, were quite antagonistic towards Islam and people of Muslim faith. I'm among those Norwegian anti-racists who have worked both in a professional and activist capacity in order to make the argument that Muslims are and must be an integral part of the anti-racist struggle that we're in. Statistics on education in Norway, in fact, tells us that females of immigrant background, descendants of immigrants in Norway, are educationally performing significantly better than their Norwegian female counterparts, and are more likely to pursue higher education than their female Norwegian counterparts. They are also fast making their marks in all sorts of educational and professional fields, in politics, the arts, academia, sports, in NGOs, and in the legal and medical fields. In doing so, they make the Muslim presence in Norway and Europe, and the idea that Muslims are co-citizens, partaking in the creation of a future convivial Norway and Europe, much more palatable.
Thank you, Professor Banstad, for that excellent exposition, a long, a very wide canvas that you laid out, beginning with the historical context of the presence of Muslims in Europe and how since then it has been problematic, your reference to Spain, and then moving on to the racist ideologies of the ultranationalism, of the nation being sacred, and this is something which is kind of it's something very central to the right-wing political discourse and parties, and how this right-wing political discourse in a sense is taking over not just the space which they are creating themselves, but also the mainstream political parties. And I think there is a problem there because that is where you see the space getting restricted, and the earlier discourse of accommodation that becomes more questionable, because ultimately political parties are there to win elections, and so whatever wins elections, they tend to side with that. So we have seen a shift, not just in what the right-wing political parties are saying, because that's what their whole plank is: anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, Islamophobia, nation and national identity, Euroscepticism. That's all part of their what they are. But to also see that seeping into the mainstream political parties and their co-opting of some of these positions, which then make it problematic because, in a sense, as some of the scholars like Casmund have pointed out, that even if the right-wing political parties per se don't win the elections, the fact that they have eroded that space and they have moved into the mainstream political parties have actually opted some of their ideas, and they would be the ones who would be winning. So then in any case, the whole discourse and the possibilities of accommodation and negotiation get restricted. I think in all of this, I'm sure there would be questions, and I'm going to just open it up for discussion. One would like to also understand of where European Union comes in. When we look at, for instance, when you're talking in terms of the European canvas, yes, historically things have happened. Then there are these member states. Norway is not one, but in different member states, many of these things are happening in terms of the shrill rhetoric that you see vis-a-vis Muslims and the othering and Islamophobia, which we, as I said, also see very starkly played out during the refugee crisis, when the Central European countries were, they had come out blatantly saying that we don't want refugees, and if at all, we want only Christian refugees. So we have seen this kind of a discourse. So wherein does the European Union as a project stand? And all of this becomes important to understand, because after all, when you look at the European Union, its projection is about soft power based on norms, values, human rights, which also it kind of articulates when it establishes relations globally across with states. So I think I'll now open up for discussion and questions. I already see one hand up. Javed, can I request you to put your question, please?
Thank you both of you for these wonderful points that you've made. But Professor Sindre, I have 3 questions for you, and all 3 are interconnected. I'll use your presence as an anthropologist. So all the questions are pitched from a very anthropological point of view. So, in the narrative and, the data and the empirical material that you presented, beyond that, I want to ask you a few conceptual questions. One is about this concept called conspiracy, because, conspiracy is a term that recurred throughout your lecture. How do you look at it as a concept anthropologically? What is its utility? Second is another concept I would like to invoke here is of the threshold, right? What is the political threshold, in your opinion, or as per your reading, when conspiracy actually gains legitimacy, And third is you use the term mobilization. But mobilization is also occurring, as per your narrative and other stories that we hear about Europe, both for inclusion and exclusion, right? So there is a kind of a contestation. And you use the term co-citizens. So I'm again kind of inviting you to kind of tell us a bit more about this co-citizenship, but then there's also this co-constitution that is happening. So one is creating the other, and the other is also having an impact on the one. So, I'm kind of more interested in hearing more from you on this. Thank you very much.
These are absolutely central conceptual questions, and I have to apologize for trying to cover such a broad canvas, right? So this, I imagine, as a public lecture to a non-specialist, a non-anthropologically largely audience, and obviously the questions that you raise are extremely interesting and important from an anthropological point of view. I would try to answer them briefly. So conspiracy theories in an anthropological conceptualization. There's recently been a very interesting article by Professor Didier Fassin of the Institute for Advanced Studies, which I might want to refer you to. I mean, part of our challenge as anthropologists is here that, on the one hand, we'd like to record what people actually say and think about what they're doing, right? And the very concept of conspiracy theory can, of course, become also something of a scholarly blunt instrument with which to beat anything you disapprove of, right? So, and politically, it often functions that way in sort of liberal political conceptions these days, right? So this is something we also need to think about as anthropologists, and it's an ongoing and important conversation for that reason. This question about the threshold, when does it cross into the political mainstream? I think, conspiracy theories are at the most efficient when they're able to play on thoughts and ideas that are already out there, right? In the public at large, right? And this is what makes them so frightening when it comes to these far-right conspiracy theories, right? I'm speaking from the US now, and if we look at the US context, I mean, it's a matter of public record that a very influential media personality like Tucker Carlson of Fox News, who speaks to an enormous constituency of Trumpian Republicans in this country, has hundreds of times in his broadcasts referred to the Great Replacement theory, a conspiracy theory, and this is broadcast to tens of millions of Americans on a daily and weekly basis, right? And he's also not only a hardcore supporter of Trump, he's also a hardcore supporter of Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? So that tells you that we're not, in this case, referring to a fringe phenomenon. And obviously, public media has a role to play here. The crossing of the threshold has a lot to do with what the media in any given country at any given time permits of this, right? And this often gets quite challenging, right? Because part of the performance of the far right in a number of countries involves invocations of free speech, right? So if you're shut down from huge media platforms on the basis that you're peddling conspiracy theories, you're all of a sudden a victim of persecution and something of a free speech martyr, right?
I have been facing this question during my research also. there is a lot of pressure on immigrant population to be integrated or sometime to be assimilated. This question of integration, that the population which is coming from outside should be integrated. We also see similar questions and pressure of integration, even for the population who have been living in a country, for example, for 500 years. But for some political incorrectness, they have become other. For example, if you say in India, certain population, Indian Muslims are being asked to prove that they are fully integrated, that they are fully Indianized, that they are fully nationalized in the standard of what they have set as a standard. Here, what comes in my mind, a question that, do you think there is a tension between neoliberal politics and nation state itself? Nationalism has its own pressures, and neoliberalism has another trajectory where there will be more and more interaction among all kind of people. There will be more movement, there will be more mobility, there will be more plurality and diversification coming in coming decades. But the nationalism and nationalist ambitions are having a tension with this kind of waves which are coming and which will come. Here comes in my mind the interesting sentence, which quotation of Professor Anthony Giddens, who once said that democracy needs to be democratized more. So have we come here at a point where we are going to see a necessary confrontation or tension between neoliberalism and nationalism, especially when it comes to treating the outside other different populations, so-called?
Well, first of all, to this very concept of integration, I'm among those scholars who are extremely skeptical about the entire discourse about integration. And Professor Sarkar actually addressed this in her brilliant introduction, because the way in which the discourse about integration functions in Norway and the Nordic countries in particular has become very one-sided, so that it is as if, you know, the only onus when it comes to integration is on immigrants, people of immigrant background, to adapt to our ways, right? Which to my mind is a position taken that is antithetical to the notion of a co-citizenship, right? Because what I understand with co-citizenship is that we, regardless of where you come from, what class background you may have, what national origin you may have, what religious faith you happen to have, we all share this country, and we are responsible for what happens in this country. So, you know, the notion of a shared co-citizenship, to my mind, is about acknowledging all citizens on equal terms. What gets lost here is, of course, also the fact that we have a number of people, actually thousands of people in Norway and the Nordic countries, who, because of their asylum status and the fact that Norway, like many European countries, are increasingly trying to seal their borders and create a fortress Europe, live in a permanent state of non-citizenship, right? We may here think of, you know, Hannah Arendt's seminal work on refugees and what it, you know, the dire implications of not belonging to a state, right? In a sort of liberal democratic setup, right? Because rights are tethered to citizenship, right? So we have thousands of people in Norway and the Nordic countries who live in a permanent state of exception because of not having access to citizenship, right? One can think of, stateless Palestinians living in Norway who have had their asylum applications turned down for some reason or other. I mean, this is also real, so we need to think about that. Now, to this question about neoliberalism and nationalism, and this is an enormous question, of course, right? But I think the tendency in a lot of scholarship has been to think of nationalism and neoliberalism as antithetical, as opposing forces, right? And to think of neoliberalism as a political and economic formation which isn't anchored in the nation state. But if we look at the scholarly literature on neoliberalism that has come out in recent years, and I'm thinking here of the work by scholars such as Quinn Slobodian, for example, and in anthropology, William Massarella, it's also clear to me that we also need to unthink this idea that neoliberalism is all about the free flow of goods and persons, right? In the conceptualization of neoliberalism, of neoliberals themselves, it is often quite striking that they depend on the nation state to realize their visions. So I don't see these necessarily as antithetical forces. In fact, you could turn this around and say that neoliberalism and neoliberal agendas in Europe and Norway have played a central part in preparing the grounds, as it were, for the emergence of right-wing populism. Because Norway, to a lesser extent than other Nordic countries, I mean, Sweden is the primary example of full-scale privatization of state resources, the educational sector. That hasn't happened to the same extent in Norway, but it's certainly the case that the problems and the still ongoing problems relating to the political and democratic legitimacy of social democracy in a country like Norway has to do with the fact that social democrats in Norway in power in the 1980s and 1990s were central to implementing quite neoliberal practices, right?
Thank you for your lecture and your, prolonged responses to the queries raised. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you who took part in this, and thank you for hosting me.